Today, after central banks, what? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics World. Let's post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. There was an outstanding piece from John Authers this week, arguing that the age of credibility of central banks is in question, because the inflation blunders have destroyed the trust that's anchored the global financial system since the end of the gold standard. Certainly in Australia, the RBA has been on shaky ground for many years, including over-forecasting wages growth, taking interest rates too low, and relying on household wealth to be artificially inflated by poor policy for years. But the shocking reversal from last November's no-rate rise till 2024 to today's 1.35% target cash rate, with more to come, shows just how far from credible they are, despite politicians still talking about mountains of respect. And over in New Zealand, they are further up the curve, but the issues there are just the same. Central bank credibility is shot. As Authers writes, monetary regimes don't fall often. Half a century ago, in 1971, Richard Nixon ended the age of the gold standard by formally eliminating the dollar's peg to the precious metal. Since then, the dollar and other currencies have rested on fiat. They're worth something because governments say they are. You could call this the age of credibility. In place of gold, currency's anchor is the trust in the central banks that issue them. But now credibility appears to be at an end. With central banks desperately ripping up their playbooks to try to rein in inflation that's veered far beyond target, they're admitting they've been wrong and giving up on trying to steer the markets on their plans for the future. That's alarming because the president of the 1970s is not encouraging. Oil briefly took over from gold as the anchor for currencies, and the world suffered through a period of protracted stagflation. The new age of credibility arrived courtesy of Paul Volcker, who as chairman of the Federal Reserve raised rates repeatedly at the turn of the 1980s and managed to squeeze inflation out of the system. For the 4 decades since, central bankers' credibility has been the anchor, provided everybody trusts central bankers to do what it takes to protect the buying power of the money fiat currencies can work. A credible central bank doesn't even need to act. Mere words are usually enough to keep markets in line. In late 1996, Fed Chair Alan Greenspan provoked a stock market correction by musing about the possibility of irrational exuberance in a speech. And European Central Bank President Mario Draghi halted the Eurozone's sovereign debt crisis in 2012 by promising to do whatever it takes to save the currency, and he never needed to do anything more. Draghi's predecessor, Jean-Claude Trichet, even worked out his own code. If he said he was extremely vigilant, everyone knew that was a promise that rates would rise at the next policy meeting. One notable feature of the age of credibility is that inflation stayed quiescent. From 1994 to 2021, central banks' preferred gauge of consumer prices, excluding food and fuel, never once rose above the 3% top of the target range set in the US and the Eurozone. Japanese inflation was far lower. But now it's time to ask whether low inflation was the result of central banks' credibility, or rather the cause of it. It may just have been a fallacious confluence of factors. Demographics were favourable, with working age population growing and saving for the future. Globalisation, notably China's insertion into the global market, held down labour costs. Commodity prices stayed under control in comparison to the 1970s, with only a brief interruption when a bull market in oil turned into a price spike in the pre-crisis summer of 2008. In such an environment, inflation wasn't difficult to tame. And also, crucially, it was almost costless to bail out the markets with lower rates in a crisis. When Draghi promised to do whatever it took, he meant that he was prepared to cut rates or buy government bonds or take other actions that would normally stoke inflation. With Europe battling a deflationary slump, he could do this. That no longer holds true. Also absent for decades, aggressive fiscal policy. Expansive Keynesian investment programs went out of favour in the early 1980s, and in the Western world there were increasingly vocal calls for balanced budgets, with elected governments generally trying to avoid what were pejoratively known as tax and spend policies, all the more weight was placed on central banks and their credibility. That approach has been fraying for years. With the bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2000, the central banking commitment effectively became one of not allowing stock prices to fall too much. And the 2008 financial crisis ushered in a decade when central bank credibility hinged on keeping bond yields low and trying to raise inflation, not lower it. The pandemic-induced surge in prices has laid waste to central bankers' credibility. The Fed and its peers around the world badly misjudged the path inflation would take, initially dismissing it as transitory. After a series of bad calls, they can no longer confidently guide the markets on their next steps. So they've given up. June saw Fed Chair Jerome Powell reverse confident guidance that a 0.5 percentage point rate increase was not on the table and hiked them by 0.75%. And also in June, ECB President Christine Lagarde had to convene an emergency meeting of policymakers less than a week after their regular conclave in response to a speculative attack on Italian government bonds. That sell-off had been triggered by the ECB's failure earlier to address the question of how it would keep different countries' debt in line once it began hiking rates in July. Unlike Draghi, a decade earlier, she needed to prove that she had a plan to stop the region's debt markets from fragmenting. And elsewhere, the Bank of England appeared to promise a rate hike in November last year, shocked everyone by not delivering, and then caused just as much surprise by hiking in December. And the Swiss National Bank stunned the world on June the 16th, not only by hiking for the first time in more than a decade, but also by doing so by 0.5 percentage point. So the question then is, what comes next? The implicit plan of the bankers is that after some now unavoidable 70s-like chaos, central banks will regain their credibility and order will be restored. But that's going to be difficult to achieve. Trust in all institutions is painfully low as it is. The word of Powell or Lagarde is no longer as good as Volcker's, and certainly not as good as gold. Central banks have lost credibility in large part because they've had to do too much, with elected governments unwilling or unable to take the measures that might spur growth or to deal with crises. Unelected technocrats had to fill the vacuum. They didn't do this willingly. The ECB dragged its feet for more than 2 years during the sovereign debt crisis in an attempt to force politicians to fix the euro structural flaws. Ben Bernanke, as Fed chair, insisted that the Troubled Asset Relief Program bank bailout money should be voted on by Congress and not spirited into being by the central bank. But in both cases, politicians left it to the bankers to sort the mess out. Arguably, the key reason inflation returned last year was that in 2020, governments had at last resorted to stimulative spending to tide businesses and households through the worst of the pandemic, and central banks didn't grasp that this meant they could desist from buying bonds, a policy known as quantitative easing. The Fed didn't make its final QE purchases until March of this year, while the ECB is due to make its own final purchases this month. With the cost of living back as a major issue, it's become a matter for politicians to wrestle with and not technocrats at the Fed, much as was perceived to be the case throughout the 1970s. For some, it may even be a matter of survival. In the US, Republicans are wielding the word Bidenflation as a cudgel heading into November's midterm elections. Joe Biden's administration and many other governments are looking for ways to combat inflation other than with monetary policy. And across the world, populist pressure is on governments from the left and the right to take a more active role in the economy by, for instance, capping or subsidising energy costs for households to minimise their pain in the short term. Thus, it appears that the most likely anchor to replace central bank credibility is confidence in governments, but that is not a comforting thought at all. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.